Welcome. Before we begin today's story, take a moment to imagine a place that looks calm, orderly, and almost too perfect to be real. Neat houses lined up along quiet streets. Lawns trimmed to the same height. Driveways polished, curtains drawn just right. From the outside, everything feels balanced, controlled, and secure. This is where our story begins. In the years following World War II, the United States entered a period of dramatic change. The war had ended. Factories shifted from military production to consumer goods, and millions of soldiers returned home carrying hopes for stability after years of uncertainty. Out of this moment emerged a powerful national dream, the suburban ideal. It promised safety, comfort, and a fresh start. A life away from crowded cities. A home with space, privacy, and predictability. For many families, suburbia was not just a place to live, it was proof that the future could be orderly again. New neighborhoods appeared, almost overnight. Identical houses stretched across former farmland, each one designed to represent efficiency and optimism. Inside these homes, modern appliances hummed quietly. Kitchens gleamed with chrome and pastel colors, and every room suggested progress. Advertising, television, and magazines reinforced the same message again and again. This was what success looked like. A good home, a reliable husband, well-behaved children, and at the center of it all, a woman who made everything run smoothly. The role of women in this new suburban world was carefully defined. Popular culture framed domestic life not as a limitation, but as a calling. Women were encouraged to find fulfillment through managing the home, supporting their families, and maintaining an atmosphere of calm efficiency. Cooking, cleaning, hosting, and organizing were presented not as labor, but as expressions of love and identity. The ideal homemaker was cheerful, capable, and endlessly composed. This expectation carried weight. A well-run home became a symbol of moral success. Neighbors noticed details. Kitchens were expected to be spotless. Meals needed to be timely and fresh. Children had to appear cared for, and husbands should come home to an environment that felt restful and welcoming. Any sign of disorder, spoiled food, cluttered shelves, poorly stored leftovers could feel like a personal failure rather than a simple inconvenience. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, daily life was far from effortless. Managing a household required constant planning and repetition. Meals were prepared multiple times a day. Groceries had to last. Leftovers needed to be stored safely. Without modern solutions, small problems added up quickly. Food spoiled faster than expected. Containers leaked. Smells lingered in refrigerators. What seemed minor could quietly disrupt the sense of control women were expected to maintain. At the time, food storage was surprisingly unreliable. Glass containers were heavy and fragile. Metal tins could affect taste and rust over time. Wax paper and foil offered temporary solutions, but they were far from airtight. Refrigerators were improving, but without proper sealing, freshness was never guaranteed. Every kitchen had its own system of compromise, and every compromise risked waste. This mattered because waste carried social meaning. In an era shaped by wartime rationing, throwing food away felt irresponsible. A homemaker was expected to be efficient, resourceful, and precise. Saving leftovers was not just practical, it was a measure of competence. When food spoiled unexpectedly, it was easy to feel that something had gone wrong, even if the tools themselves were inadequate. Meanwhile, the culture of suburbia intensified observation. Homes were no longer private spaces alone. They were stages. Guests stopped by. Neighbors visited. Coffee was served in living rooms designed for display. Kitchens, once hidden workspaces, became points of pride. Hosting was common, and hospitality was judged quietly but constantly. A clean refrigerator, neatly organized shelves, and fresh-tasting food all contributed to an unspoken reputation. Magazines of the era captured this atmosphere perfectly. Their pages showed smiling women in immaculate kitchens, effortlessly balancing multiple tasks. There was no visible stress, no mess, no trial and error. The message was subtle but powerful. Perfection was not only possible, it was expected. And if it was not achieved, the responsibility rested with the woman managing the home. This pressure created a strange contradiction. Suburbia promised comfort and ease, yet demanded constant vigilance. Women were encouraged to stay within the home, but also to excel endlessly inside it. Their success was measured not in promotions or public achievements, but in invisible details, freshness, order, presentation. Small innovations could make a meaningful difference, even if they seemed insignificant on the surface. It was within this environment that new household products began to matter in unexpected ways. Objects were no longer just tools. They were solutions to social expectations. A better stove meant fewer mistakes. A better refrigerator meant more control. And eventually, a better container meant peace of mind. These items promised not just convenience, but confidence. Plastic, however, was still unfamiliar. To many families, it felt experimental and untested. Glass and metal had history behind them. Plastic was new, flexible, and oddly light. It did not look serious. Yet its very newness hinted at something else: adaptability. The possibility that daily problems did not have to be accepted as normal. At this point in history, few people could have predicted how deeply a simple kitchen object would connect to broader cultural shifts. Food storage seems mundane, almost invisible in the grand story of society. But in the suburbs of post-war America, it sat at the intersection of technology, identity, and expectation. It touched routines that defined womanhood itself. The suburban ideal relied on systems, working smoothly. When they did not, tension appeared not always visibly, but internally. Women learned to adjust, compensate, and normalize frustration. Yet they were also open to solutions that fit seamlessly into their world. Anything that reduced effort without challenging social norms was welcomed. This is why the setting matters so much. Without suburbia, without the pressure of perfection, without the quiet competition of domestic excellence, the next chapter of this story would never have unfolded the way it did. The conditions were just right. A society eager for order, homes designed for display, and millions of women managing complex routines with limited tools. What began as a dream of stability slowly revealed its hidden demands. And within those demands, even the smallest improvement could feel revolutionary. Not because it changed the world overnight, but because it changed how daily life felt: one meal, one container, one carefully organized refrigerator shelf at a time. As we move forward in this story, remember this moment. A world that believed it had reached perfection, yet quietly struggled with the details. A culture that valued control, yet lacked the tools to fully achieve it. And a generation of women standing at the center of it all, ready whether they knew it or not for something new. Because sometimes, history does not turn on wars or leaders, but on ordinary problems waiting for the right solution. In mid-century American kitchens, leftovers were an unavoidable reality. Meals were prepared in large portions because families were bigger, shopping trips were less frequent, and cooking from scratch took time and planning. Throwing food away was discouraged, both by habit formed during wartime rationing and by social expectations tied to responsibility and thrift. Saving what remained after a meal was not optional. It was part of the daily rhythm of household life. Yet the simple act of preserving food was far more complicated than it appeared. Before modern plastic containers became common, kitchens relied on a patchwork of storage solutions that had changed little for decades. Glass jars were widely used, often repurposed from store-bought products. Metal tins, originally designed for baking or dry goods, were pressed into service for leftovers. Plates were stacked and covered loosely with wax paper or cloth. Aluminum foil existed, but it was thin, easily torn, and expensive enough that it was reused whenever possible. None of these methods were designed specifically for airtight, long-term storage of prepared food. Glass containers had advantages, but they also came with constant risk. They were heavy and slippery when wet. Lids rarely fit perfectly, and many jars were mismatched, missing their original tops. A sudden bump against the sink or countertop could shatter a container instantly, turning a routine task into a mess and a loss. For families with children, glass also posed a quiet danger, especially in crowded refrigerators where items were stacked tightly together. Metal containers introduced their own problems. They could dent easily, preventing lids from sealing properly. Certain foods reacted with metal, altering taste or leaving faint discoloration. Moisture trapped inside could lead to rust, especially around seams and edges. Over time, these containers developed odors that were difficult to remove, passing unwanted smells from one meal to the next. What was meant to preserve food often compromised it instead. Wax paper and cloth coverings were among the most common solutions, largely because they were flexible and familiar. A plate of leftovers might be covered with wax paper pressed down around the edges, held in place by hope more than design. Cloth covers, sometimes elasticized, were reused repeatedly, absorbing smells and stains over time. These methods offered minimal protection against air, moisture, or cross-contamination inside the refrigerator. They slowed spoilage slightly but could not stop it. Refrigerators themselves were improving, but they were not yet the precise, evenly cooled appliances people expect today. Temperature control varied from shelf to shelf. Door seals were imperfect. Frost buildup was common. Food placed too close to cooling elements could dry out, while items placed elsewhere might not stay cold enough. Without airtight containers, leftovers were exposed to all these inconsistencies. As a result, uncertainty became part of everyday decision-making. A dish saved from dinner might look fine the next day, but smell questionable. Housewives learned to rely on instinct rather than clear indicators. Was the food still safe, or merely familiar? Could it be served again, or would that risk embarrassment or waste? These judgments were made quietly, often alone, and carried emotional weight. Spoilage was not just inconvenient. It felt personal. When food went bad, it could seem like a failure of planning or care, even though the tools available were limited. In a culture that linked domestic competence to personal worth, these small losses added pressure. A refrigerator containing spoiled leftovers was not merely a technical problem. It challenged the image of control that women were expected to maintain. Odors were another constant struggle. Without sealed containers, smells traveled freely inside refrigerators. Strong foods affected everything around them. Milk absorbed flavors. Desserts picked up savory notes. Ice trays, often uncovered, became carriers of unwanted taste. A refrigerator could develop a persistent smell that no amount of cleaning fully removed. Baking soda helped, but it addressed the symptom rather than the cause. Space was also an issue. Refrigerators were smaller than modern models, and shelving was less flexible. Storing multiple plates, bowls, and jars required careful stacking. One unstable pile could collapse, spilling sauces or gravies onto other items. Cleaning these messes took time and effort, and the result was often a lingering stickiness or stain that reminded the household of the failure long after it happened. These inconveniences shaped behavior. Some women cooked smaller meals to avoid leftovers altogether, increasing daily workload. Others reused food more quickly than they preferred, prioritizing speed over quality. Certain dishes were avoided entirely because they did not store well. Menus were influenced not just by taste or nutrition, but by how manageable leftovers would be. Social expectations amplified these concerns. Guests were common in suburban life, and hospitality was an unspoken test. Serving food that tasted stale or carried off flavors risked quiet judgment. Even within the family, there was pressure to present meals that felt fresh, not reheated out of necessity. Leftovers had to be transformed, disguised, or served carefully to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. The problem extended beyond the refrigerator. Transporting food was equally difficult. Bringing dishes to gatherings, potlucks, or neighbors required careful wrapping and balancing. Spills during travel were common. Containers tipped over. Lids came loose. The embarrassment of arriving with leaked food or a stained dishcloth lingered long after the event ended. All of this effort revolved around a basic need: keeping air out. Oxygen accelerated spoilage, dried out food, and allowed odors to spread. Yet most households lacked a reliable way to remove air from storage containers. The concept of an airtight seal existed in canning, but canning was labor-intensive and unsuitable for daily leftovers. The gap between preservation technology and everyday cooking was wide. Women adapted through routine and experience, but adaptation did not eliminate frustration. It normalized it. The small daily compromises became invisible because they were shared by everyone. Kitchens across the country faced the same challenges, and because there was no clear alternative, the problems were accepted as part of life. This acceptance created a quiet readiness for change. Not a dramatic demand, but an openness. If a solution could fit into existing routines without disrupting social expectations, it would be welcomed. The ideal product would not challenge the role of the homemaker or require new skills. It would simply work better. What made the situation especially significant was how central leftovers were to domestic efficiency. Saving food connected directly to budgeting, planning, and time management. A household that handled leftovers well appeared organized and competent. One that struggled seemed chaotic, even if the cause was technological rather than personal. In this way, food storage became symbolic. It represented control over time, resources, and space. A container that leaked or failed undermined that control. A container that worked promised something rare: predictability. Knowing that food would stay fresh removed one small but persistent uncertainty from daily life. At this moment, plastic was still largely absent from this equation. It existed in industrial settings and novelty items, but it had not yet earned trust in the kitchen. Many people associated it with disposability or fragility. Few imagined it could outperform traditional materials in something as important as food preservation. Yet the problem was clear, even if it was rarely articulated. Kitchens were full of effort, but short on reliable tools. Leftovers were essential, but difficult to manage. The gap between expectation and reality remained, waiting quietly for something new to fill it. When that solution arrived, it would not announce itself as a revolution. It would appear modest, almost unremarkable. But its impact would be felt immediately, because it addressed a problem everyone knew, but few had the words to describe. The struggle with leftovers was not dramatic enough to make headlines. It did not inspire speeches or movements, but it shaped daily behavior, emotional labor, and the rhythm of domestic life. And in doing so, it prepared an entire generation to recognize the value of a simple promise: food that stayed fresh, sealed, and under control. Earl Tupper did not set out to change domestic life. His work began far from suburban kitchens, in industrial laboratories where materials were studied for durability, flexibility, and cost. During the 1930s and 1940s, plastic was still largely a technical curiosity, valued more for industrial use than for anything personal or intimate. It was associated with factories, machinery, and mass production, not with food, families, or everyday routines. Yet within this unlikely material lay a solution to a problem millions of households quietly faced. Tupper was an inventor with a practical mindset. He paid close attention to materials that others overlooked, particularly polyethylene, a byproduct of oil refining that was considered waste by many companies. Polyethylene was lightweight, resilient, and resistant to breakage. It did not rust or shatter. It could be molded into precise shapes and returned to its form after bending. To most manufacturers, it was unappealing, too soft, too flexible, too unfamiliar. To Tupper, it represented potential. Working independently, he experimented relentlessly, heating, shaping, and refining polyethylene until he understood its behavior. He discovered that when molded correctly, it could create containers that were strong without being heavy, flexible without being fragile. Most importantly, it could form a tight seal. This detail mattered more than anything else because it addressed the central problem of food storage: air. The idea of sealing food from air was not new. Canning had relied on this principle for generations. But canning required heat, time, and permanent closure. It was not designed for leftovers or daily use. What Tupper envisioned was something different: a container that could be opened and closed repeatedly, yet still protect food from air exposure. This required precision in design, not just material choice. After numerous failures, Tupper developed a lid that fit snugly over a container's rim, creating an airtight environment when pressed correctly. The seal depended on flexibility. When the lid was applied, excess air could be pushed out, and the material would then hold its shape, maintaining pressure along the edge. This process would later be known informally as burping, though at the time it was simply a mechanical solution to a persistent problem. This seal transformed the container from an ordinary storage item into something fundamentally new. Food stayed fresh longer. Liquids did not spill. Odors remained contained. The container could be stacked, transported, and reused without fear. What had once required constant caution now felt manageable. Yet despite its effectiveness, the invention faced resistance. Plastic carried stigma. Many consumers associated it with cheapness or disposability. It lacked the reassuring weight of glass and the familiar solidity of metal. Early reactions to Tupper's containers were cautious, even dismissive. They looked unusual. They felt different. Their flexibility seemed suspicious rather than beneficial. In stores, customers struggled to understand why they should trust food to something that bent under pressure. Tupper initially attempted traditional retail distribution, placing his products in department stores alongside more familiar kitchenware. The results were disappointing. Without explanation or demonstration, the containers appeared unimpressive. Customers did not understand the seal. They pressed the lid without removing air, failed to achieve the intended effect, and concluded the product did not work. The innovation was invisible unless shown correctly. This misunderstanding highlighted a critical truth: the product required education. It could not sell itself on appearance alone. Its value lay in experience, feeling the lid flex, hearing the subtle sound of air escaping, noticing how food remained fresh over time. Without guidance, the breakthrough was lost. Despite these setbacks, the design itself was sound. Tupper refined the containers further, improving the smoothness of the material and the precision of the seal. He paid attention to color, opting for soft, modern tones that suggested cleanliness and progress rather than industrial harshness. The containers were meant to belong in kitchens, not factories. What made this development significant was not just the invention of a better container, but the reimagining of what plastic could be. It was no longer a novelty or a substitute. It was superior in function. It solved problems glass and metal could not. It reduced fear of breakage. It offered consistency. It promised control. In a domestic environment where small failures carried emotional weight, this mattered deeply. A container that worked reliably removed one layer of stress from daily routines. It allowed leftovers to become assets rather than risks. It made planning easier. It aligned perfectly with the suburban emphasis on efficiency and order. Still, the breakthrough remained incomplete without acceptance. Technology alone could not overcome habit and perception. Plastic needed trust, and trust required familiarity. This gap between invention and adoption would soon be filled not by engineering, but by social interaction. Tupper understood materials, but he underestimated culture. He believed a good product would naturally succeed. What he learned, slowly and at great cost, was that innovation often needs a translator. Someone who can show, explain, and reassure. Someone who understands not just how something works, but how people feel about it. The containers themselves were quiet objects. They did not demand attention. They did not advertise their complexity. They simply waited to be used correctly. And when they were, their impact was immediate. Food stayed fresh. Spills stopped happening. Refrigerators became cleaner, more predictable spaces. This quiet effectiveness would soon collide with a louder force, human connection. Because once people saw the containers in action, skepticism faded quickly. The problem was getting them to see it at all. Earl Tupper's breakthrough was not just technical. It was conceptual. He had taken an industrial material and adapted it to one of the most intimate spaces of daily life. He had created something modern without appearing radical. Something innovative without challenging social norms. The invention did not promise freedom or transformation. It promised something far more appealing in mid-century suburbia: reliability. In a world built on routine and expectation, that promise carried enormous weight. The stage was now set. The solution existed. The problem was widespread. All that remained was a way to bring the two together, not on store shelves, but in living rooms, kitchens, and conversations between neighbors. Plastic entered American homes quietly, and at first it was met with hesitation rather than excitement. For generations, kitchens had been built around materials that felt permanent and trustworthy. Glass was heavy, solid, and transparent. Metal was firm, durable, and familiar. These materials carried history. They had proven themselves through decades of daily use. Plastic, by contrast, arrived without memory. It was light in the hand, flexible under pressure, and visually unfamiliar. To many homemakers, it did not feel like something that belonged near food. This skepticism was rooted not only in habit, but in meaning. In mid-century America, materials carried social signals. Glass suggested cleanliness and honesty because its contents were visible. Metal suggested strength and reliability. Plastic, still associated with novelty items and industrial byproducts, seemed temporary. It bent when squeezed. It made no reassuring sound when placed on a counter. It lacked the weight that people unconsciously equated with quality. There was also concern about safety, even if it was rarely expressed in technical terms. Plastic was new enough that many people simply did not know how it behaved over time. Would it absorb flavors? Would it stain? Would it affect food in ways that were not immediately visible? Without long experience to rely on, suspicion filled the gap. When something unfamiliar touches something as intimate as food, caution feels reasonable. Early encounters with plastic containers often reinforced doubt. When used incorrectly, the containers did not perform as intended. Lids placed loosely failed to seal. Air remained trapped inside. Food spoiled at nearly the same rate as before. For consumers encountering the product without instruction, this confirmed their assumptions. Plastic, they concluded, was no better than what they already had, perhaps worse. Retail environments did little to change these perceptions. On department store shelves, plastic containers looked plain. They did not sparkle like glass or reflect light like polished metal. Without demonstration, their most important feature, the airtight seal, was invisible. Shoppers compared them based on appearance alone and saw little reason to trust them with an important task. Price also played a role. Although plastic containers were not necessarily expensive, they were costly enough to invite comparison. Why pay for something that seemed less substantial? Why replace tools that already worked, even imperfectly? In a household budget carefully managed, unnecessary risk felt irresponsible. Beyond practicality, there was an emotional barrier. Many women had learned their domestic routines through observation and repetition. They inherited habits from mothers and grandmothers. Introducing a new material into the kitchen felt like questioning that inherited knowledge. Accepting plastic meant admitting that traditional methods might be flawed, and that was not an easy shift to make. This resistance was strongest among older generations, but it influenced younger homemakers as well. In suburban neighborhoods where conformity was subtle but powerful, adopting something unusual invited attention. Using plastic containers instead of glass jars could feel like stepping outside the norm. Even small deviations carried social awareness. Plastic also lacked ritual. Glass jars had histories. Metal tins had designated purposes. Plastic containers arrived without ceremony. There was no established way to use them, no shared understanding of their role. Without ritual, objects feel disposable even when they are not meant to be. Yet despite this hesitation, curiosity remained. Plastic was appearing everywhere else in toys, household tools, and packaging. It represented modernity, even if that modernity felt unsettling. The post-war era celebrated progress, but progress was expected to feel solid and dependable. Plastic challenged that expectation by being light, flexible, and unfamiliar. The contradiction created tension. On one hand, households wanted solutions to persistent problems. On the other, they hesitated to trust a material that defied traditional cues of quality. This tension slowed adoption, but did not stop it entirely. It created a need for reassurance rather than rejection. Trust, it turned out, could not be built through advertising alone. Printed claims and slogans did little to overcome tactile doubt. People needed to see plastic perform under real conditions. They needed to watch it bend without breaking, seal without force, and protect food over time. Until then, skepticism remained the default response. The containers themselves were quietly waiting. Their design was sound. Their function was reliable. What they lacked was context. Without understanding, plastic felt like a compromise. With understanding, it would feel like an improvement. The challenge was bridging that gap. This skepticism, while slowing early success, played an unexpected role in what came next. Because plastic could not rely on instant acceptance, it required a different path into the home. It needed explanation, demonstration, and repetition. It needed to be experienced rather than displayed. In resisting plastic, consumers were not rejecting innovation. They were protecting familiarity. They wanted assurance that change would not introduce new problems. Once that assurance was provided, resistance softened quickly. But until then, plastic remained an outsider in the kitchen present, promising and quietly misunderstood. This moment of hesitation was crucial. It shaped how the product would be introduced, who would introduce it, and where trust would be built. The skepticism toward plastic did not stop its rise. It redirected it. Because if plastic could not earn trust on a shelf, it would have to earn it in the most convincing place possible, inside the home, through shared experience, observation, and proof. And that shift from store aisles to living rooms would change not only how plastic was sold, but how domestic authority itself was expressed and shared. The problem with plastic was never performance. It was understanding. The containers worked exactly as designed, but their value remained hidden unless someone showed how to use them properly. Unlike glass or metal, plastic demanded interaction. It needed to be pressed, flexed, and sealed in a specific way. Without that moment of realization, it looked ordinary. With it, the difference was undeniable. Demonstration transformed skepticism into clarity. When people watched a lid bend slightly, heard the faint release of air, and felt the container lock into place, doubt began to dissolve. The action was simple, but it carried meaning. Air was removed. Control was established. For the first time, food storage felt deliberate rather than improvised. Seeing the process mattered more than hearing about it. Written instructions were insufficient. Labels could not convey the sensation of the seal forming. Advertising images could not replicate the sound or pressure involved. Demonstration made the invisible visible. It revealed what plastic could do that other materials could not. This realization changed the setting in which the product made sense. Department stores were loud, crowded, and rushed. Shoppers handled products briefly and moved on. There was no time for explanation, no space for trial and error. A plastic container that required a moment of instruction was at a disadvantage there. Homes, by contrast, offered attention. In a living room or kitchen, people slowed down. They watched. They asked questions. They compared results. Demonstration turned a passive object into an active experience. Instead of imagining how something might work, viewers witnessed it. The container could be filled with liquid, turned upside down, and remain sealed. It could be pressed and released without damage. It could be opened and closed repeatedly without losing its effectiveness. Each action contradicted assumptions about plastic. Each success replaced doubt with surprise. What made these demonstrations especially effective was who performed them. They were not conducted by engineers or salesmen in uniforms. They were shown by people who used the containers themselves in spaces that felt familiar. This removed the distance between product and daily life. Trust formed quickly under these conditions. When someone demonstrated the container in their own home, it felt tested rather than promoted. It felt practical rather than abstract. Viewers could imagine the container in their own refrigerator because they were already standing in a similar space. Demonstration also allowed comparison. Traditional storage methods could be shown alongside the new container. A plate covered in wax paper could be tipped and fail. A glass jar could clink uncomfortably against the counter. Then the plastic container could be handled without fear. The contrast spoke for itself. Importantly, demonstration respected the intelligence of the audience. It did not insist. It showed. It allowed viewers to draw their own conclusions. This was critical in a culture where homemakers took pride in their competence. Being told something was better was less persuasive than discovering it firsthand. The act of sealing the container became a small ritual. Pressing the lid, releasing the air, and feeling the seal form provided a sense of mastery. It was quick, repeatable, and satisfying. That feeling lingered long after the demonstration ended. As more people witnessed these demonstrations, word spread. Conversations shifted from skepticism to curiosity. People did not describe the container in technical terms. They described the experience. They talked about the seal, the sound, the way it felt. The product entered social language before it entered widespread use. Demonstration also reframed plastic itself. It was no longer just a material. It was a system. The container, the lid, and the action worked together. This made plastic feel purposeful rather than cheap. It was engineered, not improvised. The success of demonstration revealed something broader about innovation. New ideas often fail not because they are ineffective, but because they are unfamiliar. Familiarity requires exposure. Exposure requires time. And time requires the right environment. In the case of plastic containers, that environment was not a store. It was a shared space where people gathered, observed, and discussed. Demonstration turned selling into teaching. It transformed a product into a lesson. Once someone understood how the container worked, there was little reason to return to older methods. The improvement was immediate and obvious. Food stayed fresh. Spills stopped happening. The refrigerator became easier to manage. These benefits did not need explanation. They were felt. This shift marked a turning point. The product had found its voice not through marketing, but through experience. And once people experienced it, they wanted others to do the same. Demonstration did more than sell containers. It created confidence. It empowered users to explain the product themselves. Each person who learned the technique became capable of showing it to someone else. The act of demonstration multiplied naturally. What began as a solution to a practical problem was becoming something social. The container was no longer just stored in cupboards. It was talked about, shown, and shared. Plastic had found its path into the home not as an object on a shelf, but as an experience passed from one person to another. And from that realization, a new method of selling would emerge, one that relied not on stores or advertisements, but on people inviting others to watch, learn, and see for themselves. The shift happened quietly, almost accidentally. Once demonstration proved essential, the question became where it could happen naturally. The answer was not a showroom or a counter, but a living room. Homes were where routines were understood, where questions felt safe to ask, and where practical solutions could be evaluated honestly. Inviting people into a familiar space changed the entire dynamic. It replaced persuasion with participation. These gatherings began small. A few neighbors, a pot of coffee, a table cleared just enough to display containers. There was no stage, no spotlight. The setting was casual by design, because the product was meant to solve everyday problems. In this environment, the containers felt less like merchandise and more like tools being shared. What made these gatherings effective was their rhythm. Conversation came first. People talked about families, schedules, meals, and the small frustrations of daily life. Food storage problems surfaced naturally, without prompting. Only then did the demonstration begin. It felt responsive rather than rehearsed. The host was not an outsider. She was someone known and trusted. Her home was proof that the product belonged there. When she showed how a lid sealed or how a container prevented spills, it carried the weight of personal endorsement. This was not a promise made by a company. It was a solution tested by a neighbor. These gatherings soon took on a recognizable structure. Guests arrived, chatted, watched the demonstration, and passed containers around. They pressed lids themselves, turned containers upside down, and listened for the sound of air escaping. Each action reinforced understanding. Questions were answered in real time. Doubt had no space to linger. The atmosphere mattered as much as the information. Laughter eased hesitation. Familiar faces reduced pressure. No one was rushed. Decisions were made calmly, without the tension of a sales floor. Buying felt like a natural extension of understanding, rather than a transaction. As these events repeated, they gained a name. Calling them parties emphasized their social nature. The word suggested hospitality, not obligation. It framed the experience as enjoyable rather than commercial. That framing lowered defenses and invited participation. The party format also solved a practical problem: education at scale. One demonstration reached many people at once. Each guest left capable of explaining the product to someone else. Knowledge spread outward, not through advertisements, but through conversation. This method aligned perfectly with suburban life. Homes were close together. Social visits were common. Schedules overlapped. Hosting was already part of a cultural fabric. Adding a demonstration to a gathering felt natural, even efficient. The party also changed how value was perceived. Instead of evaluating containers by price alone, guests evaluated them by performance and relevance. They imagined specific uses in their own kitchens. The decision to buy felt informed and personal. Importantly, the party did not disrupt social norms. It reinforced them. Hospitality remained central. The host provided refreshments. Guests showed appreciation. The transaction was woven into existing rituals rather than replacing them. This made participation feel appropriate and comfortable. The format also created momentum. Hosts often became interested in hosting their own gatherings. They had witnessed the effect firsthand. They had seen skepticism turn into confidence. Hosting offered a way to share something useful while fulfilling social expectations. As more parties took place, a network formed. Information moved quickly. People compared experiences, shared tips, and discussed outcomes. The product became part of conversation, not because it was advertised aggressively, but because it solved a shared problem. The party environment also allowed for storytelling. Hosts spoke about spills that no longer happened, food that stayed fresh, refrigerators that felt easier to manage. These stories were specific and relatable. They carried more weight than generic claims. What emerged was a new kind of marketplace, one based on trust and familiarity. Transactions occurred within relationships. Value was demonstrated, not asserted. The boundary between social interaction and commerce blurred in a way that felt natural rather than intrusive. This approach changed who held authority. Knowledge did not flow from companies to consumers. It flowed between peers. The person demonstrating the container was not positioned as an expert, but as someone sharing a discovery. That distinction mattered. The party also created a sense of occasion around an ordinary object. The act of gathering elevated the container's significance. It became something worth talking about, worth showing, worth remembering. That emotional imprint lasted longer than a simple purchase. Over time, the format became standardized, but its power remained rooted in intimacy. Even as numbers grew, each gathering felt local. Each demonstration felt personal. This balance allowed expansion without losing trust. The birth of the party was not a marketing strategy imposed from above. It was an adaptation shaped by necessity. Plastic needed explanation. Explanation needed attention. Attention thrived in homes. The party was the natural outcome of these conditions. What began as a solution to a distribution problem became something larger. It created spaces where women gathered, learned, and shared experiences. It validated domestic knowledge and turned it into something visible and valued. The container had finally found its stage. Not under bright lights or behind glass, but on kitchen tables and coffee tables, surrounded by conversation. In that setting, its value was clear. And once the party existed, it opened the door to something unexpected. Because the people who hosted and demonstrated were not just users. They were organizers, teachers, and connectors. They were about to become something more. The party was only the beginning. As the parties spread from one neighborhood to another, the role of the host began to change. What started as a simple act of hospitality slowly became something more structured, more intentional. Women who opened their homes were no longer just inviting friends over. They were guiding an experience. They demonstrated products, answered questions, and facilitated decisions. Without formal titles or training at first, they stepped into a role that blended familiarity with authority. This role fit seamlessly into the rhythms of suburban life. Hosting was already expected. Managing schedules, preparing refreshments, and making guests feel comfortable were skills women practiced daily. The party format did not ask them to abandon these skills. It elevated them. What had once been informal labor became visible, purposeful, and valued. Selling in this context looked different from traditional commerce. There were no counters, no uniforms, no pressure tactics. The host spoke from personal experience. She showed how she used the containers in her own kitchen, how they solved her own problems. Her credibility came not from credentials, but from relatability. Guests trusted her because they recognized themselves in her routines. This trust transformed conversation. Questions were practical and specific. How long did food stay fresh? Could the containers be stacked easily? Were they difficult to clean? The host answered honestly, often demonstrating in real time. If a container resisted a stain or held liquid without leaking, it did so in front of everyone. Proof replaced persuasion. As demand grew, hosting became an opportunity. Women realized that these gatherings could generate income. Commissions offered a tangible reward for effort that had previously gone uncompensated. For many, this was their first experience earning money independently, even if the sums were modest at first. What made this opportunity unique was its flexibility. Hosting did not require leaving the home. It did not conflict with childcare or household responsibilities. It could be scheduled around existing obligations. In a society where women's mobility and employment options were limited, this mattered deeply. The role also offered recognition. Successful hosts were noticed. They were praised for organization, clarity, and confidence. Their names circulated within neighborhoods. This visibility provided validation that extended beyond the home. It acknowledged skills that had long been taken for granted. Importantly, this work did not challenge social expectations directly. Women were still operating within domestic spaces. They were still hosting, still serving, still managing households. Yet within those familiar boundaries, they exercised agency. They made decisions. They tracked orders. They managed relationships. The act of selling became inseparable from teaching. Hosts explained not only how the containers worked, but why they mattered. They framed the product as a solution to shared frustrations. In doing so, they positioned themselves as sources of practical knowledge. Over time, some women moved beyond hosting occasional gatherings and became regular presenters. They learned how to structure demonstrations, how to anticipate questions, and how to guide discussions smoothly. Experience sharpened their skills. Confidence grew through repetition. This confidence was subtle but significant. Speaking in front of a group, even a familiar one, required composure. Answering questions required clarity. Managing orders required attention to detail. Each task reinforced a sense of capability. The social nature of the work reduced fear of failure. Mistakes were corrected gently. Support came from peers. The environment encouraged participation rather than competition, at least initially. Learning happened collectively. For many women, this role provided a new identity alongside existing ones. They were not only wives or mothers. They were hosts, presenters, and earners. This identity did not replace the old ones, but it expanded them. The income itself mattered, but so did what it represented. Earning money through one's own effort, even within the home, altered self-perception. It introduced the idea that domestic knowledge had market value. This shift was not dramatic or confrontational. It did not arrive as a declaration of independence. It arrived as a practical adjustment, justified by usefulness. Yet its impact was lasting. Neighbors began to see hosts differently. They were approached for advice, invited to organize gatherings, and asked about opportunities. Authority grew organically, rooted in competence rather than status. The structure of this work also fostered networks. Hosts connected with other hosts. Information was shared. Techniques were refined. A sense of belonging formed among women who participated regularly. These networks provided more than business support. They offered social connection, especially for women who spent much of their time within the home. Meetings, calls, and shared experiences created a broader sense of community. Through hosting and selling, women exercised skills that had rarely been acknowledged publicly. They negotiated, explained, organized, and led. They did so without abandoning the social roles expected of them, which made the change feel acceptable and sustainable. This balance was key. The opportunity did not demand rebellion. It offered recognition within existing norms. that made it accessible to a wide range of women, not just those seeking change, but those seeking improvement. As participation increased, the line between host and saleswoman blurred further. The role became normalized. It felt less like stepping into commerce and more like extending hospitality with purpose. What emerged was a quiet transformation. Domestic spaces became sites of economic activity. Conversation became a vehicle for commerce. And women, long positioned as consumers, became intermediaries. This transformation would deepen as the gatherings continued. Because hosting was not just about selling containers. It was about creating moments of connection, shared understanding, and mutual reinforcement. And as these moments accumulated, they began to shape something larger than any single gathering. A culture of participation where women were not just maintaining households, but actively shaping how products entered them. As the gatherings became more frequent, something subtle but powerful began to take shape. The parties were no longer just about containers or even about selling. They became social events with their own rhythm, language, and shared understanding. Attendance was not driven solely by interest in a product, but by the promise of connection. In neighborhoods where daily life could feel repetitive and isolating, these gatherings offered a sense of occasion. Ritual played a central role. The demonstration followed a familiar sequence. Containers were introduced. Lids were pressed. Air was released. The soft sound that accompanied the seal became recognizable. Repetition transformed this action into something more than technique. It became a shared moment, one that marked participation and understanding. Learning the seal felt like initiation. Once someone mastered it, they belonged. They could explain it, demonstrate it, and recognize it when others performed it correctly. This shared knowledge created a quiet bond among participants. It separated those who had experienced the demonstration from those who had not. Rituals create meaning by repetition, and here repetition carried reassurance. Each gathering reinforced the same message. The containers worked, the method was reliable, and the experience was shared. Familiarity reduced doubt and replaced it with confidence. The social aspect extended beyond the product. Conversations flowed easily. People exchanged tips not only about storage, but about meals, schedules, and routines. The party became a space where domestic challenges were acknowledged collectively rather than managed alone. This collective acknowledgement mattered. In a culture that emphasized individual responsibility for household success, admitting frustration could feel risky. At these gatherings, frustration was normalized. Others nodded in recognition. Solutions were shared. The burden felt lighter when it was understood as common. Belonging emerged through participation. Being invited signaled inclusion. Hosting signaled trust. Attending signaled engagement. These signals reinforced social ties within neighborhoods. The parties became markers of connection, reminders that one was part of a network. The ritual also carried a sense of mastery. Pressing the lid correctly produced an immediate result. That success was satisfying. It offered a small but tangible sense of control, something valued deeply in domestic life. Mastery over an object translated into confidence in routine. As more people adopted the containers, the ritual extended into everyday life. Using them at home recalled the moment of learning. Each seal echoed the shared experience. The product carried the memory of belonging with it. This memory mattered. Objects that carry stories are valued differently. The containers were not anonymous purchases. They were reminders of conversations, laughter, and shared discovery. This emotional layer increased attachment. Community also formed among hosts. They shared strategies, successes, and challenges. They supported one another, exchanged advice, and celebrated milestones. These interactions created a secondary layer of belonging, one rooted in shared responsibility. Recognition reinforced this bond. Hosts were acknowledged for effort, skill, and consistency. Praise came not only from the company, but from peers. This validation extended beyond sales numbers. It affirmed competence and contribution. The parties created a space where women could speak with authority about domestic matters. Their knowledge was visible and respected. This visibility countered the invisibility often associated with household labor. Belonging also reduced risk. Trying something new feels safer when others are doing it too. Seeing neighbors adopt plastic containers reassured those still uncertain. Participation spread through observation as much as invitation. The ritual simplicity made it accessible. No special equipment was required. No advanced knowledge was needed. Anyone could learn. This inclusivity broadened participation and reinforced the sense that the experience was for everyone. As the network grew, the parties became anticipated events. They punctuated routines. They offered novelty within familiarity. The product was consistent, but the conversations were not. Each gathering reflected the personalities and relationships of those present. This combination of ritual and variation kept interest alive. The seal remained the same, but the stories around it evolved. New uses were discovered. New contexts were shared. The product adapted through community. Belonging also came with identity. To participate was to be part of something modern, practical, and informed. It aligned with the suburban emphasis on progress without appearing radical. It felt safe, yet forward-looking. Over time, the ritual extended beyond the party. People demonstrated the seal casually to visitors. They explained it to relatives. The act became shorthand for understanding. No lengthy explanation was needed. The motion said enough. The community that formed around these gatherings was not loud or confrontational. It did not declare itself. It simply existed, reinforced by repetition and shared experience. Yet its impact was real. Through ritual, ordinary objects became anchors of connection. Through community, practical solutions became shared knowledge. Through belonging, participation felt meaningful rather than transactional. The containers succeeded not only because they worked, but because they were embedded in social life. They became part of how people related to one another, not just how they stored food. And within that sense of belonging lay the foundation for something even more significant. Because once people feel connected, they begin to imagine possibilities beyond the original purpose. The gatherings were about to offer more than community. They were about to offer opportunity. As the gatherings became routine and the community around them strengthened, a quiet shift took place. What had begun as occasional hosting evolved into a recognizable form of work. It did not resemble traditional employment. There were no offices, no fixed hours, no formal hierarchy visible to outsiders. Yet it required skill, planning, and consistency. For many women, this was the first time their everyday abilities translated directly into economic activity. This model of work fit neatly into existing lives. It did not demand a departure from the home, nor did it require permission to enter male-dominated spaces. Instead, it reframed domestic expertise as a resource. Knowledge of kitchens, schedules, and social rhythms became assets rather than obligations. Work happened in familiar rooms, at familiar times. It was woven into routines rather than layered on top of them. Invitations were extended during school hours. Demonstrations took place around dining tables already used daily. Orders were taken alongside conversations. This integration made participation feel manageable, even sustainable. Importantly, this work offered choice. Women decided how often to host, how much effort to invest, and how far to extend their involvement. Some treated it as a modest supplement. Others recognized potential for growth. The absence of rigid structure allowed participation at multiple levels. Income, while not always substantial, carried symbolic weight. It represented autonomy. Earning money through one's own initiative, even within the home, challenged assumptions about dependency. It introduced the idea that contribution could be measured financially as well as emotionally. This shift altered self-perception. Handling orders, tracking commissions, and planning events required organization and foresight. Success depended on communication and reliability. Each completed gathering reinforced competence. The work also encouraged goal setting. Hosts set targets, anticipated outcomes, and adjusted strategies. These were skills commonly associated with professional environments, now practiced in domestic ones. Unlike factory or office work, this model allowed visibility of effort. Family members saw preparation, hosting, and follow-up. Children observed organization and negotiation. The work was not hidden. It unfolded in shared spaces. This visibility mattered. It normalized the idea of women engaging in economic activity without abandoning domestic roles. Work and home were not opposing forces. They coexisted. Support networks strengthened this model. Hosts shared experiences, offered advice, and celebrated milestones. Learning was collective. Challenges were discussed openly. This reduced isolation and encouraged persistence. Recognition played a role as well. Achievements were acknowledged publicly within the network. Titles, awards, and milestones created motivation. They validated effort and provided benchmarks for progress. The model also rewarded initiative. Those who invested time and creativity saw results. This direct connection between effort and outcome was empowering. It contrasted with domestic labor, where effort was constant but recognition uncertain. Crucially, this work did not require abandoning social norms. It operated within them. Hospitality remained central. The home remained the setting. This compatibility made participation accessible to women who might otherwise hesitate. Over time, the model revealed its scalability. Some hosts expanded their reach, organized multiple gatherings, and mentored others. Leadership emerged organically, based on experience and trust rather than formal authority. This expansion did not erase challenges. Balancing responsibilities required careful planning. Time management became essential. Yet the flexibility of the model allowed adjustment rather than withdrawal. The broader implication was subtle but significant. Work no longer required physical separation from domestic life. Economic contribution could originate from within the home, using skills already present. This reframing altered how value was understood. Domestic knowledge, once considered private and unproductive, proved transferable and profitable. It gained legitimacy through structure and reward. As more women participated, the model gained visibility. It became recognizable as an option, not an exception. Conversations shifted. Hosting was no longer just social, it was purposeful. This new model did not challenge existing systems directly. It operated alongside them, gradually expanding what was considered possible. Change arrived through participation rather than protest. The gatherings that once centered on containers now centered on opportunity. The product remained important, but it had become a vehicle rather than the destination. Through this model, women experienced a form of entrepreneurship shaped by collaboration, flexibility, and trust. It was quiet, adaptable, and effective. And, as with any model that proves workable, it invited ambition. Because once autonomy is tasted, even briefly, it invites the question of how far it might go. As participation expanded and success became more visible, the atmosphere began to change. What had once felt purely cooperative slowly acquired an edge. Friendly neighborhoods, built on familiarity and routine, now contained overlapping ambitions. Hosting was no longer just an act of sharing. It was also a chance to perform well, to be recognized, to stand out. Competition entered quietly. It was rarely spoken aloud, but it was felt. Who hosted the most gatherings? Who attracted the largest groups? Who earned recognition fastest? These questions circulated beneath polite conversation, shaping behavior without announcing themselves. In suburban communities where social status was subtle and carefully managed, this new form of work introduced a new metric. Success was visible. Orders were discussed. Rewards were displayed. Achievement could be noticed, even if it was framed as modest. This visibility altered relationships. Invitations became strategic. Schedules were negotiated carefully. Some hosts worried about overlapping events or competing interests. The same networks that had fostered support now required navigation. Comparison intensified. Seeing a neighbor succeed sparked mixed emotions, admiration, motivation, and sometimes quiet resentment. In communities where conformity was valued, standing out carried both reward and risk. The competitive element did not erase cooperation entirely. Advice was still shared. Encouragement remained common. But beneath these gestures lay awareness of ranking and progress. Success was no longer abstract. It was measured and acknowledged. This tension reflected broader social dynamics. Women were encouraged to excel domestically, but discouraged from overt ambition. The work challenged this balance. Wanting to succeed was acceptable, but wanting it too openly could feel uncomfortable. As a result, ambition was often expressed indirectly. Effort was framed as enthusiasm. Achievement was attributed to luck or support rather than strategy. This careful language allowed competition to exist without violating social norms. The structure of the work reinforced these dynamics. Recognition systems highlighted top performers. Rewards created incentives. Milestones marked progress. These mechanisms motivated participation, but also sharpened comparison. Social gatherings felt different under these conditions. Conversations included subtle references to performance. Praise was measured. Compliments carried nuance. The social fabric adjusted to accommodate new roles. For some, this tension was energizing. It provided purpose and challenge. For others, it introduced stress. Balancing relationships with ambition required emotional labor. Conflicts, when they arose, were often indirect. Disappointments were managed quietly. Frustrations were discussed privately. The emphasis on politeness prevented open confrontation, but did not eliminate strain. This period revealed the complexity of integrating work into social life. When economic goals intersect with personal relationships, boundaries blur. Success becomes relational as well as individual. Yet even this tension contributed to growth. It clarified commitment. Those who continued learned to navigate complexity. They developed skills in diplomacy, timing, and self-presentation. Competition also accelerated innovation. Hosts refined their demonstrations. They improved organization. They sought new ways to engage guests. The desire to perform well raised overall quality. The presence of competition signaled legitimacy. The work mattered enough to care about. It was no longer a casual pastime. It was meaningful. At the same time, the community adapted. Norms evolved. Boundaries were negotiated. The balance between support and rivalry became part of the culture. This balance was imperfect, but it was instructive. It showed that opportunity brings complexity. It also showed that women were capable of navigating that complexity within existing social frameworks. The tension did not undermine the system. It tested it. And through that test, the model proved resilient. Because beyond competition lay something even more visible. Rewards that transformed private success into public symbols. And with those symbols came a new kind of aspiration. As the system matured, success began to take on visible form. Effort was no longer rewarded only through quiet income or internal satisfaction. It was marked publicly, celebrated openly, and displayed unmistakably. Recognition became a central feature of participation, transforming achievement into something others could see. Awards arrived first as symbols. Certificates, pins, and titles acknowledged milestones. They created hierarchy without formal authority. Advancement was measured, tracked, and celebrated. Each marker offered motivation, reinforcing the connection between effort and outcome. Then came the rewards that captured attention beyond the community cars. Branded vehicles were not merely practical incentives. They were declarations. Parked in driveways and on streets, they announced success without words. They transformed invisible labor into a visible sign of achievement. In suburban neighborhoods where appearance carried meaning, this visibility mattered. A car represented mobility, independence, and status. For women whose economic contributions were often hidden, it was a powerful symbol. It signaled agency within familiar boundaries. The impact of these rewards extended beyond material value. They altered self-perception. Being recognized publicly validated effort that had long gone unnoticed. It confirmed that domestic expertise could lead to tangible success. Independence in this context did not mean separation from family or tradition. It meant choice. It meant the ability to contribute financially, to make decisions, and to pursue goals. This independence was incremental but meaningful. Recognition also reshaped aspiration. Seeing peers rewarded expanded imagination. What once seemed unlikely became possible. Ambition found justification in example rather than rhetoric. The reward system reinforced commitment. Goals became clearer. Progress was measurable. The structure encouraged persistence and growth. At the same time, rewards intensified visibility. Success could not be hidden. It invited admiration and at times scrutiny. Navigating this attention required confidence. Yet the promise remained compelling. Participation offered more than products or income. It offered acknowledgement, autonomy, and a sense of forward motion. The cars, in particular, became lasting symbols. They represented not just sales numbers, but a shift in how women's work was seen by others and by themselves. This promise of independence did not overturn social structures overnight. It operated within them, subtly expanding boundaries. And in doing so, it prepared the ground for reflection. Because once independence is visible, it invites reconsideration of what had been considered possible all along. Idea 12. More than plastic containers. What began as a solution to a kitchen problem became something larger. The containers were practical, but their impact extended far beyond food storage. They reshaped routines, relationships, and roles. They entered homes quietly, carried by trust rather than advertisement. They were demonstrated, shared, and adopted through community. Along the way, they created opportunities where few had existed. The story is not about plastic alone. It is about how everyday problems intersect with culture, technology, and identity. It is about how solutions gain meaning through use. The containers worked because they fit the moment. They addressed real frustrations without demanding radical change. They respected existing roles while expanding them. In doing so, they revealed something important. Innovation does not always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it arrives as improvement, woven carefully into daily life. The legacy is not just in cupboards or refrigerators. It is in the recognition of domestic knowledge as valuable, transferable, and worthy of reward. What remains is a reminder. History is shaped not only by grand events, but by small shifts repeated across millions of homes. And sometimes, the most lasting change begins with something as ordinary as how we save what remains. When we step back and look at the entire journey, one truth becomes clear. This story was never just about objects, systems, or rewards. It was about how small, familiar actions repeated quietly in ordinary spaces can ripple outward and create lasting change. What seemed simple on the surface carried deeper meaning beneath it: recognition, confidence, and the slow reshaping of what society chooses to value. The real legacy lives not in materials or symbols, but in the shift of perspective it created. It showed that knowledge formed through daily life has power. That experience, when shared, can open doors. And that transformation does not always arrive with noise or conflict. Sometimes it arrives gently, one household at a time. These stories matter because they remind us how history often moves, not only through dramatic events, but through subtle changes that feel almost invisible while they are happening. By the time their impact is recognized, the world has already moved forward. Thank you for spending this time with us and for exploring this story together. If you found value in it, stay curious, keep questioning what feels ordinary, and join us again for the next story where the past, the present, and the unseen connections between them continue to unfold.